on behalf of the hosts here, I want to thank you for joining this webinar on mental health and climate change. In particular, the Millikan team here, led by Lynn Goldman, the Millikan Institute of Public Health, the Climate and Health Institute, and the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health. And then on the team that put together the report, on behalf of the American Psychological Association and ecoAmerica and its Climate for Health program, thank you very much for joining. Next slide. Also, just an absolutely huge thanks to all the people who put together this report, all of the authors and reviewers and editors and contributors that put it together. This isn't the first time we've done it, it's the third time, and the team really an extraordinary amount of research, extraordinary amount of wisdom and experience going behind this report. It has not just problems in it, it has solutions, and if there's one thing that you should have when you're trying to learn more about mental health and climate change, it's this report. Next slide. And Mark, let's just go to the slide with the speakers here. I can go through the agenda on that one. We're going to start here with my good friend Lynn Goldman, who is the Dean of the School, Millikan Institute of Public Health at School of Public Health at George Washington University, and knows as much about this and climate change as anybody I know. She'll be followed by Dr. Arthur Evans, who is the CEO of the American Psychological Association, our partner in producing this report. After that, Susan Clayton will come in and overview the report. She was the primary author on the last report and the primary author on this one. And thank you so much, Susan, for all your leadership here. And then a particular area of interest, children's mental health and climate change. Dr. Lisa Van Susteren, who many of you know already, will join us to talk about that. Next slide, Mark. I just wanted to put up, mental health and climate change is becoming a thing. It's becoming a big thing. It's all over the place. And we are all dealing with it, whether you know it or not, with your families, with your kids, with your community. Climate change and mental health, the implications of mental health of climate change are impacting everybody. And knowing what to do about it and being able to coach people in a formal and informal basis, people are looking for this information. So just want to thank all of you for your work at the intersection of mental health and climate change, and encourage more and more of it. And we welcome your comments and your questions and your connections in the chat thing during this webinar. So feel free to jump in and put in anything you want. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Goldman. Hi, Lynn.
Hi, Bob, and thank you so much. I'm really excited to be welcoming all of you to this timely seminar on climate change and mental health. And a big thank you to ecoAmerica, our partner, not only in hosting this event, but also the partner with the American Psychological Association in creating the report that we will be hearing about later during the session. I am Dean of the Millikan Institute School of Public Health at GW. We're the only school of public health in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And as such, we are both advancing cutting edge research and training the next generation of public health leaders, including those who will be on the front lines of climate change and health. Next slide. Before going any farther, I want to thank Susan Annenberg for helping to organize this important seminar along with ecoAmerica. Susan is the director of the Climate and Health Institute at GW, and she also leads a team here that focuses on air quality, and especially in relation to climate change. The Climate and Health Institute at GW is at the forefront of study on climate change, human health, and equity, and that includes some of the serious impacts climate change can have on mental health. Climate change can lead to extreme weather, population displacements, serious health issues, and climate anxiety, to name just a few of the negative impacts. And these impacts often fall more heavily on vulnerable communities around the world, as well as vulnerable subgroups like infants and the elderly. And I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to the 11th Annual Climate Leadership Summit, which is taking place March 28th to the 31st. I encourage you all to attend the summit where you can learn more about climate change and the actions we can all take now, as well as make connections with people who are committed to this issue, whether from the health community, the faith community, justice communities across our country. Last but not least, I want to thank ecoAmerica for partnering with us on this seminar and for their wonderful report, which was produced with the American Psychological Association, Mental Health and Our Changing Climate. Next slide. Their report chronicles the impacts of climate change on mental health and provides resources that might help to ease those burdens. I will say that this is a very new area. There's a lot of research underway. This report is a snapshot and a point of time that's a very important moment when we're pivoting toward making serious investments in understanding all of the health, including mental health impacts on climate. So finally, I'd like to turn this virtual podium over to Dr. Arthur Evans, the CEO of the American Psychological Association, the leading scientific and professional organization representing all psychologists, but especially those who do research in the United States. Dr. Evans, please take this away.
Okay, good. Well, I thought Bob was going to go next, but I'm fine with going if that's okay. Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction and thank all of you for being here. What I thought I would do in the time that I have is talk about just provide an overview of APA's involvement in this issue, since Dr. Clayton is going to talk a little more about the report in particular and what we know from what we talk about in that report. So if you go to the next slide, when we think about the issue of climate change and mental health, we come at this from multiple perspectives. So on the one hand, there are clearly the mental health impacts related to climate change that our field is very interested in working on, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But we also come at this from the perspective of what our field can contribute to the issue of climate change. When we talk about mental health, we know that there are a lot of mental health impacts. They're both what happens in the aftermath of a climate event, whether it's a hurricane or forest fires or just changes in climate that cause disruptions in agriculture. But we also know that there's anticipatory anxiety related to climate change. My wife is from the Bahamas, and for most of our marriage, being part of the Caribbean, there are hurricanes, but they came, once every 10 years or so. In the last couple of decades, there have been a number of very large destructive hurricanes. And the anxiety when I go to the island for people who live on a coast, small islands, is palpable. But that's not just true there. It's true in all of the places where people are experiencing these kinds of rapid changes in climate and the impact that that's having on their lives. And so we know that we have to work at both ends of this issue. What happens in the aftermath of these events, but then how do we help communities not only deal with the anxiety related to these events, but also how do we help build resilience so that communities can bounce back in the aftermath of these kinds of events. On the climate side, we're also very interested in how can psychological science help address the issue of climate. If you go to the next slide, there are a number of areas where we think are important. If you go to the next slide, one is that we believe that if climate change is a result of human behavior, then we ought to use the science of human behavior to help address that issue. And so there are a lot of areas where we know that understanding human behavior are going to be really essential in helping us to both develop policies and strategies for dealing with climate. And so that's sort of one major area that we are very interested in. But we're also interested in, if you go back to the next slide, to the past slide, we're also very interested in how we can help people cope, as I just mentioned, both in terms of the aftermath and what happens prior to climate events. But then we're also interested in the issue of policy and how does policy get made and what kinds of policies do we have? If you look at what's happened in the during the pandemic, we know that basing our policies solely on what the science says does not go far enough. Because the other part of the equation is you have to have people willing to actually follow whatever those policy changes are or whatever those new guidelines are. And I think one of the things that's been missing throughout the pandemic is bringing that human element. How are people going to perceive a particular policy change? How do people understand the policy change? How do people frame the policy change? And so we believe that that's a really important aspect to having policies that are not only grounded in science and are good policy, but also policies that are going to be policies that the majority of the population are going to get behind and support. That's the only way they can be effective. Next slide. Finally, what I would say, one of the ways that we think is really important for our field is to create partnerships. We have a wonderful partnership with ecoAmerica that goes back many years around this issue. But we're also, if you go to the next slide, working with partners around the world. So this is a picture of a summit that we had just prior to the pandemic of psychologists from every continent except for Antarctica. I don't think we had anyone from Antarctica, but we had people from every other continent. Because this is a global issue and we're all learning in our own respective countries about issues, about strategies at work. And so the global psychological community has really come together and said that this is an issue that we need to take on as a field. That work is ongoing, and we are really trying to look at lessons learned in these various parts of the country that can be shared across the world. So last slide. We're very committed to this issue. We see our role as being not only focus on this issue of mental health, but how do we also help on the broader issue of climate? Because ultimately, the best way to deal with the impact of climate on people's mental health is to deal with the issues that are driving that, and that is climate, and how do we reverse some of the negative things that have happened over the last many years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Susan Clayton, who's going to talk more about the actual report. And Susan is not only an expert in this area, but she's also a member of the board of directors of the American Psychological Association. So we're very pleased that she is taking this leadership role on this issue. Susan.
Thank you, Arthur. And it's a privilege to be associated with the APA, and I find it not just satisfying, but reassuring to know that the organization is really doing its best to grapple with this issue and how psychology as a field and as an organization can contribute to the fight against climate change. My goal today, as you can tell from this beginning slide, is to give you an overview of the report. You've now seen the picture several times, and we really hope you'll take a look at the report. If you have additional questions or want to learn more about the issue, then you can learn today. So next slide, please. Yeah, so we are growing more and more aware, I would think, in the past 10 or even 5 years, that climate change has impacts on humans, not just on polar bears. if you could click to advance. So one of the categories of impacts it has is on physical health, but increasingly we're trying to, we're becoming more aware of the impacts on mental health and well-being as well. And if you could click ahead. A lot of people, when they first hear this, they don't really understand, although this is becoming less common. There's a sense of, oh, how could climate affect, what's inside my head, my mental state? And there are really 4 channels. One, I think that is easiest for most of us to recognize is the impact of acute events. So extreme weather events, storms, floods, wildfires, and so on. It's also very important to think about the chronic changes, the slower moving gradual changes that are part of climate change, such as rising temperatures and rising sea levels. There are indirect consequences, and I'm not going to say very much about them, but they're very important. We know that climate change is going to have an impact, for example, on agricultural productivity and potentially the nutritional value of food. So that's a pretty serious impact with potential consequences for mental health. Displacement is also a major part of climate change that can affect mental health. And then the last channel is the idea that we can have vicarious experiences or perceptual experiences, even without being directly personally affected. Our awareness that climate change is happening may lead to impacts on mental health. Next slide, please. So go ahead and click ahead. Why focus on mental health? This is a figure from the report that shows how mental health is interconnected to physical health and community health as well. I think mental health is particularly important, partly because, as I just said, it's less well recognized, and it also has the potential. We can see how all of us can be affected, regardless of whether we live by the coast or regardless of whether we live in a drought-prone area. And just click ahead, please. I really want to emphasize that mental health is health, and probably I don't need to convince anybody here, but mental health is not only as important as physical health. It's really impossible to distinguish mental health from physical health. There's so much overlap. So when we think about well-being, mental health is particularly important. Next slide, please. So natural disasters, as I mentioned, is one of the ways in which it's easiest for us to think about impacts on mental health. And we have decades of research showing that things such as PTSD, depression, general anxiety, suicide, substance abuse, even things you might be less likely to think of, like sleep disorders, and certainly interpersonal violence, all tend to go up following natural disasters because they're very stressful, traumatic experiences. They disrupt people's lives, they put them on edge, and they have, in many cases, very inadequate coping strategies or support systems. But I want to talk more about the impacts of chronic changes because I think that we've been thinking less about these and we really need to be paying attention to them. So one of the most obvious impacts or manifestations of climate change is rising temperature. And I was just reading that this January was the 6th warmest January on record. So not quite up there at the top, but definitely another one for the record books. Heat is going up, also sea levels are rising. You can go ahead and click ahead. That's going to lead to displacement and changing patterns of precipitation, which are associated with things like drought and flood, but also with increases in wildfire. And we know these chronic changes have impacts on mental health. We have decades of research showing that heat, for example, is associated with increased aggression. And there's still relatively new, but rapidly accumulating research showing that higher temperatures are associated with increased mental health events, increased levels of suicide, for example, increased admission to psychiatric institutions, and generally just decreased feeling of well-being. So those impacts are very important for us to think about. Next slide, please. Then our perceptions of climate change, our awareness can have a very profound effect on really the fundamental way in which we see the world. And I have a couple of quotes here from hurricane survivors that I think illustrate just how profound the impact can be. If you learn that everything is temporary and home does not feel like home. Dr. Goldman, I think, mentioned, if you go to the next slide, the idea that we're beginning to talk about climate anxiety. And it's only really in the past 2 or 3 years that we've started to measure climate anxiety, but looking at concern as a kind of proxy, you can see how high the levels of climate change concern are. And this is around the world, less than a year ago, survey by Pew Research. You see that very and somewhat concerned, and this is not concerned about climate change in general, but climate change will personally harm me. It's well over a majority in each of these countries. And to get at what more specifically climate anxiety might include, it's certainly a rational, reasonable response that is not mental illness. But if it becomes too strong, it may start to impair, to have an impact on our ability to function. So it can affect our cognitions and emotions, making people cry or have difficulty concentrating. It can also affect behavior. People might find that they have difficulty getting their work done or socializing. So then part of the effects of climate change are very much, as was already mentioned, that not everybody's going to be equally affected. Some groups are at greater risk. And if you click ahead to the next slide, all kinds of things make people vulnerable. Certainly, obviously, people can be more vulnerable because of where they live, if they're by the coast or if they depend on glaciers for their fresh water. You can be economically vulnerable because financial resources can help people prepare for and recover from climate impacts. But social marginalization and discrimination also make people more vulnerable, perhaps by preventing them from having access to the information or even the political power that will help them. And then there are physiological factors. Older people are more vulnerable in many ways. Children are more vulnerable. And next slide, please. Just a few words about children in particular, because it's so important to think about their impacts. And I know Dr. Van Sesteren will talk about this some more, but there's evidence that they show stronger mental health impacts after extreme weather events. They are vulnerable not only from their direct experiences, but from the experiences of those who take care of them and from their support systems. And this can affect not just their mental health, but their ability to learn, their behavior, and their emotional regulation in ways that can affect them for long-term or even permanent impacts on their adult development. And then the last, next slide, please. The last thing I want to point out about the impacts of climate change is that they threaten our, what you might call a psychological support system. So our fundamental sense of identity, the communities we live in, and the cultures that can be such an important part of who we are. All of those can be threatened by climate change. So for the last few slides, I just want to say that we want to move beyond talking about problems to also emphasize resilience, by which I mean we have to learn to adapt to the new conditions that we're facing, not just kind of prevent them, although that's good too, but we can't fully prevent them. We need to adapt to them, and we need to learn to thrive in the face of some of the events we're going to be confronted with. And that includes individual resilience, which might include emotion-focused coping, helping people to manage the anxiety and the negative impacts they're facing, but very much a long-term problem-focused coping that enables and empowers people to take action in whatever ways are comfortable for them. We also need to think about community resilience very much, providing more support for mental health and recognizing that both ecosystems and human health need to be protected and that those go together. So to close with my last slide, I like to show this quote from the Lancet, which appeared several years ago now. They talk about how we have to not only recognize that climate change is a threat, but realize that it is in fact also an opportunity for us to recognize the interdependence of human and ecosystem health and to find ways to promote increases in human health and well-being. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Lisa Van Sesteren, who's a psychiatrist in private practice and with the Climate Psychiatry Alliance.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you here today kindred spirits. I know we all are. I'm giving you my slideshow, putting that up now. 1 second, and play. So congratulations, obviously, to ecoAmerica. This is an amazing feat, and the team that put this together. I know from experience that having the numbers to wave in the air can make a compelling argument turn into an indisputable one. So thanks very much. Organizers asked me to address 3 topics, and I will proceed with that. The first topic is in general, kids and climate, specifically the emotional toll, and third, the actions the young people are taking with a focus on legal action. By raising global temperatures, we are forcing Earth's climate systems, the interactions among air, water, ice, the rocky surfaces, and the biome that are threatening to destabilize our entire systems. We are dangerously at the edge of the temperature precipice. While the future is still in our hands, if we reach threshold tipping points of temperature, a domino effect of consequences will be unleashed and control will begin slipping out of our hands. For those of us in the advocacy business, the teaching business, or just about any business, making the case for what climate disruption is doing to children is as persuasive an argument as we shall ever see. For it is the moral ground that by rights should yield to no one and no thing. Many of you may be aware of the global survey of climate anxiety in 10,000 kids that Dr. Clayton and I were involved with, she very closely. Here are some numbers from the survey that you might want to look at. 3/4 are frightened by the future. 50% say that this affects their daily lives. More than half feel the world is doomed. And they blame, 2/3 of them, the fault squarely at the feet of government. So the results were published in the December 2021 Lancet, if you want to look at the details. The kids know they are being abandoned, and they know that government leaders are betraying them. Avaaz, I want to point out, funded this global survey, and just 2 days ago agreed to fund a US survey of 10,000 kids to be released this summer. And I hasten to add, because we really need to consider this as we go about deciding where to put our efforts, that it isn't always more research and better numbers that we need, but it's putting what we already know into what we do. But we hope the results of the study influence parents to consider the mental health benefits of their children. Mental health professionals are seeing in the literature is full of a range of conditions and symptoms from climate disruption, including, as Dr. Clayton just said, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, increased drug and alcohol abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. If the parents are suffering, the kids will too. Children are particularly vulnerable to the psychological trauma of climate disruption. In addition to their deepening anger, grief, anxiety, despair, and sometimes paralysis, I would like to emphasize the expanding psychological toll from trauma. The symptoms experienced by kids from extreme weather events can rise to the level of PTSD, sometimes even long after the exposure, or triggered by a new and different stressful experience. PTSD may also arise after indirect exposure to trauma, from reflecting on traumatic experience that relatives or friends have endured, or even simply from repeatedly hearing details of traumatic events. Climate disruption can also give rise to pre-traumatic stress with the same symptoms as classic PTSD, but due to thoughts of future trauma they can't get out of their heads. The impacts of trauma can not only be enduring, they prime for future trauma. Chronic stress can be the result. The impacts of chronic stress Should be noted that brain development in children persists until the mid-20s, especially within the prefrontal cortex, where we make complex decisions and judgments, strategize and problem solve, evaluating data flowing in from other parts of the brain. Adverse conditions can permanently affect the development of the prefrontal cortex. Early exposure to climate trauma may create permanent damage to the prefrontal cortex, bringing attendant troubles with behavior, concentration, memory, problem solving, making decisions with regulation of emotions, and control of our impulses. This can be manifested by problems at school, in one's personal and social life, even with the law. Adverse childhood experiences are known causes of lifelong increased morbidity and mortality. Exposure to trauma can alter the expression of genes. Even in the absence of the original trauma, an activated genetic state coding for stress can be passed down to future generations. That the kids have been in the streets imploring us to take action is no secret. So let's talk about action. They have organized under the Sunrise Movement, Fridays for the Future, 0 Hour. They have formed divestment from fossil fuels groups at more than 100 universities. Law students recently pushed for a boycott of the law firm Gibson Dunn, which works for polluters, and so much more. A few of the youngest ones, with the help of adult experts, are now resorting to legal action. This is my bailiwick. In Juliana versus US, youth plaintiffs and climate scientist Dr. James Hansen are suing the US government on constitutional grounds that failure to take action on climate is a threat to their lives, liberty, and property. But the US government is not just being sued for failing to take action, but indeed for supporting and promoting policies that increase the dangers by providing hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry and tax breaks, encouraging permits to build infrastructure like pipelines and compressor stations, and expanding drilling for oil and gas on federal lands and offshore. In the elegant decision of Oregon Judge Ann Aiken, whose words launched the case, quote, exercising my reasoned judgment, I have no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining life is essential to a free and ordered society. While Juliana is still in the gulag of the US court system, a new case, Held versus the state of Montana, is on course to be first youth-led trial in US history. Our Children's Trust represents 16 youth plaintiffs who charge that the state's energy policies, highly dependent on the development of fossil fuels, is a violation of the Montana Constitution, which officially declares that Montana citizens have a right to a clean and healthy environment. The trial is set for February in 2023. I am the expert witness on the psychological damages to the plaintiffs in both cases. As their expert, I wrote a general report on the impacts of climate on young people and performed psychological evaluations of the plaintiffs. My report for Juliana is in the public domain and available online. The psychological evaluations of the kids are sealed to protect their privacy and to reduce the possibility that my findings could become self-fulfilling prophecies. So I will end with an important message, and that is one quoting Michael Mann that Vice President Al Gore has provided for us, and that is an encouraging bit of news, certainly for us, as we contemplate the need to take what we already know into what we do. And as was said by Dr. Evans, that it's addressing causes, not just symptoms, that will really resolve the problem of the mental health tsunami that many of us expect to begin to arise in our society. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. So we've been getting a ton of great questions from the audience, and we have about 24 minutes, which is great. We'll have a nice long question answer session, but I'm just going to dive right into it. So one of our first questions is, how can one get involved in the intersection between climate change and mental health? And I'll direct this first to Bob and then open it up to all panelists.
Well, seeing as how this is an education-oriented audience, obviously become more educated. And we do have at ecoAmerica, the American Climate Leadership Summit, which will be providing more information on this at the end of March. And then, but the other thing that we have is with all of our climate, faith, and health programs, there's online SAP Litmos, like a Coursera LMS system, where you can go and you can learn more about climate change. You can become a climate ambassador. If you're in the health thing, there's a program just for you on the Climate for Health website, and we'll be putting up customized ones, hopefully with our great partner, American Psychological Association, soon. And so, yeah, get more educated and get out there and live your values.
Thanks, Bob. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? Other ways to get involved for all the audience members? Go ahead, Lynn.
So those of you who are affiliated with the George Washington University, to get in touch with our Climate and Health Institute. We do have faculty members who are quite interested in this area, would love to find people to collaborate with in every possible way, whether it is research or in how we're educating students, educating the public, or the work that we do in communities. So you'd be welcome.
Go ahead, Lisa. You can jump right in.
Okay. I have a comment that addresses something very personal, and that is that I find that I am most passionate and authentic when I know that my values, the ones that I'm espousing, are consistent with the choices that I make in my life. And while people will often say, don't look at individual contributions, on the contrary, we certainly will not forget the role of fossil fuels and corporations. But when you have looked very scrupulously at your own choices, and you have gone through, like a newly elected sheriff, all the ways in which you could be smarter about your energy choices, your decisions, not only for you personally, relieving you of the sense that there's the hypocrisy factor, which when dealt with unleashes the passion, but just like votes on election day, all of our contributions are counted together. So have a look at what you're doing in your life so that you can add to the cumulative effect of what we all do collectively.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, another question from the audience is, are there any toxicological effects from pollutants on mental health? And maybe we can also touch on air pollution with that one. It's open to all panelists.
I mean, I'll start. The tremendous impacts that have been documented, whether the pollutants are metals like lead and mercury, particulate matter pollution that affects brain development, as well as a number of things that are winding up in our drinking water and food that we don't understand very well, but seem to be quite neurotoxic. And these, unfortunately, many of these pollutants are either increased in the presence of warming, such as particulate matters or pollution, or actually interact. And so that is a very important issue, and one where I think particularly when we have pollutants that are quite persistent, like the heavy metals, like the polyfluorinated, the PFAS chemicals, we really have to be much more cautious. And I agree with Dr. Van Susteren. This goes to actually also what we're doing in our lives, that we are avoiding those products that create those products that disperse those into the environment that expose us and our family members.
I'll jump in if no one else is, but you can always cut my mic, Nicole. It just so happens that ultrafine particulate matter is a special interest of mine. I know that and I will let people know that it's particulate matter that is so small that it's typically not measured, but it's the most densely present in our atmosphere. And it crosses into the blood-brain barrier, across the nasal mucosa when we breathe in, and it also crosses from lung tissue into our bloodstream. And that ultrafine particulate matter goes all over the body and into the brain, which is why we are seeing most likely so many associations that it causes inflammation in every sector of the body, whether it's cardiovascular impacts from inflammation, or digestive or other impacts, and in the brain. And this is what's key, I think, for us as mental health professionals. We have seen that dementia is associated with inflammation and air pollution, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Parkinson's, and even some of the classic psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder, certainly anxiety, people ending up in the ER on days of very poor air quality, but obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'm sure we're going to be learning so many other conditions. So it is really important when we see roads being built by schools, get out there and protest, because this is going to hurt kids the most.
Thank you. Anybody else have anything to add on that one? All right, on to our next question. What are the implications of the scarcity of mental health providers who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color for climate health equity? And also maybe we can touch on too how the hosting organizations are trying to make a difference in that.
I can speak to that issue. It's a big concern at the American Psychological Association. In fact, we just passed some policies regarding our field's role in helping to address the scarcity in many communities of color. I think it's in the impact is in two ways that the way I would think about it. One is that when we have diverse perspectives on issues, we get better solutions. We know that if we have groupthink around an issue, we're not going to be as good as if we have a diverse set of ideas that are looking at an issue and tackling an issue. And a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about the connection between mental health and climate change, we're still learning a lot. And we're still learning a lot, not only about what that connection is, but what are the interventions that are going to be impactful. So we need diverse group of perspectives on that. We also know that people are, in many instances, particularly in communities of color, are going to want to see people from their own communities, people who understand their communities, as a part of the people who are helping people cope with these issues. So it's important from the perspective of people who are impacted. But I also think it's important for us to understand that on these issues, the reason that we talk about cultural competence is that simply being a member of a community does not mean that you are competent to deal with the cultural aspects of that community. And it doesn't mean that if you're not a part of that community, that you cannot develop the competence to work effectively in those communities. So even as it's important to have people of color working on these issues, it's also important that people who are not a part of those communities develop the understanding to work effectively in those communities, because we're going to need a lot of folks helping to address this, because we know that those communities are disproportionately impacted by the issues that we're talking about.
Thank you, Arthur. We're getting so many good questions, so hopefully we can dive deep into a few more, and then I may, in the last 5 minutes or so, do a lightning round, and we can get through hopefully 4 or 5 then. So many good ones coming in. So another one is, how do we as a society validate eco-anxiety instead of framing it as something that's unusual or unhealthy? And in previous webinars, we have talked about this too, that the idea of eco-anxiety is somewhat negative sometimes, but it is a natural response. So how can we validate that feeling?
I'll start off with that. I think it's a great question. It's one that whenever I talk about climate anxiety, I try and stress that it's a rational response. In fact, anxiety itself is a very functional emotion because it tells us that there's a problem that needs our attention. So I think being careful whenever we do our messaging to say, yes, this is happening, but it doesn't necessarily indicate mental illness. It's only a source of stress that we need to be paying attention to.
I think the other thing that's important is that, you know, if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's that all messages don't land the same way across the population. And I think we have to be very careful about the language that we use, the framing that we use, and how we come at these issues. You know, for example, I think that the issue around the impacts go far beyond people who are, you know, living in areas, urban areas or coastal areas where you might think of those communities as being more open to these issues. They impact the whole country, and I think it's important to understand how do these issues play out in you know, in different communities, and then what's the frame in those communities that's going to make more sense to people. So I just think we need to think about the political divide that we have in our country and how we talk about these issues in a way that will resonate across the political spectrum.
Thank you. All right, next question. Small island nations tend to have the least contribution to climate change, yet suffer the most. However, I see that there is limited epidemiological data in these areas, let alone ones that track mental health. So this attendee is wondering if any of you have seen these areas getting more attention recently.
I can say absolutely yes. It's certainly true that we tend to overrepresent the countries that that most researchers live in, which tend to be the Western countries. But I've seen several studies from, for example, the Philippines and at least one other place, but I'm not 100% sure. I remember which one it is. So I'll just say the Philippines and another small island country. Several of the studies in the Philippines have looked specifically at climate anxiety, the sort of the proportion of the population that experiences it, and its association with more general measures of mental distress like anxiety and depression. So people are aware, researchers are aware of how important it is to study these topics in the countries that are really beginning to experience them or already experiencing them in very profound ways.
So Nicole, I would say that I agree with Susan that we're beginning to see the research. However, I think we need far more, and I think we need to look distinctly at the phases that are involved. You know, prior to the impacts being manifested, the anxiety, the awareness of being in an area that is likely to experience severe impacts, the during severe impacts are being experienced. And then, unfortunately, for those who have been forced to relocate, forced to retreat, the impacts on mental health and also, frankly, also physical health. This is where mental health and physical health really intersect a lot. And I think Susan's data showed us that people who have had to relocate their communities, that the social as well as mental health and physical health impacts need to be understood, as well as how to prevent those impacts. Unfortunately, I agree with what Dr. Van Susteren showed us, that we can turn things around, but we're not turning them around fast enough. And we need to be able to learn more about how we can help to support the resilience of communities that are already being forced to retreat from the effects of climate change.
Thanks. And before we move on to the next question, I'll just add to that an attendee, Chanel, is doing research on this specific topic right now. So if other attendees have any insight or are also doing research, perhaps you can connect in the chat.
And if I could actually jump in again, I saw that there was a question in the chat about the Lancet study. And it included 10 different countries around the world, and there was definitely an attempt to get a range of different countries, and some of the ones we included were Brazil, Nigeria, India, and the Philippines. So those were included in that paper.
I might add one thing also, and that is the Caroline Hickman, who is the lead author on that paper, has talked to young people in the Maldives. And if somebody wants to email me, Caroline is very, very lovely and responsive, and I'll bet you she would share some of those very poignant, disturbing, really, interviews with the kids.
Thank you. All right, so our next question is about climate change communication. So we have an attendee from the Chesapeake Bay area, and they're wondering for folks who the phrase climate change may not be the best way to communicate the issues, how else can we talk about climate change, specifically for groups that may be really affected, but and they see the impacts every day, but the phrase climate change can't really be said in their community?
I think it's really important to, somebody may have already said this, to know your audience and put things in terms of the values that will matter to them. Some research has shown that actually health messaging works really well. So telling people about how you don't have to use the words climate change. You can say, you know, it has been getting really hot, and it seems like it's going to keep getting hotter. And look at these disease impacts, look at these impacts on asthma and so on. So that would be one example. Yeah, I'll
Another
let
one,
others jump in.
you know, there's we have a guide on the ecoAmerica website. It's called 15 Steps to Climate Communications, and there's a whole raft of things we're dealing with. As I mentioned before, Catherine Hale says our issue now is not so much communicating with deniers or questioners so much as it is giving people a path forward. And so I would, you know, we say in that guidance to say changing seasonal weather patterns, you know, changing, you know, that what you can see around you with your eyes, make it personal, make it real, and then use words like seasons and temperature and sea level rise, examples of it. Without it, you can go do a whole speech on climate change without ever mentioning it, using words like that.
One other, Bob, just to add to that, is that in faith communities, talking about stewardship and recognizing that the creator or the Lord or whatever is the image that draws them should be invoked as something that is desired to provide a planet in at least as good a state as that you received it, and ideally even better. So it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, for people to get creative, looking at the word cloud of the people that you're talking to, use their words, use their phrases, as Susan said, their values, et cetera. And that it is a wonderful publication that you've put together on communication.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, so a current Doctor of Public Health student at GW asks if there have been any community level interventions that the panelists know of that have been developed to actually try to reduce the negative social behavioral effects of climate change, such as increased suicide, violence, and aggression. So community level interventions. Anybody? Perhaps this is something that the Doctor of Public Health.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't want to jump in, but this is a key issue, and that is that mental health professionals typically have worked in our offices and our academic institutions, and we've been in our private practice, you know, seeing patients and things like that. Sure, there's a community psychiatry segment, but I really think that mental health professionals need to reimagine themselves, because society at large will need us, and it will need us to bring disparate groups together so we can address the social ills that are resulting from climate stressors. Because right now, to answer that question, we all grew silent. And that's because that's the next step, is recognizing that these social determinants of health need to be addressed in order to address the ills that society will be suffering from. And, you know, there's also the issue of regression. I'll just say this: when people are scared, they regress. And the fear that they have is one of the reasons that we're so polarized.
So I would assert that that comment from the doctoral student is why we need young people moving into this field, because she can see this issue from a perspective that is relevant to the situation today, necessary, and someday she might be among the world's experts in this. When you're young and you identify an issue like this that needs to be addressed, don't feel deterred by the fact that none of the people on the panel have a response to it. You're hitting in an area that desperately needs to be addressed, and it is the people in your generation who are going to move forward and do that. So
I completely agree. All right, we have 4 minutes left, so let's do a really quick lightning round and then we'll wrap it up. My first question, maybe one sentence from each panelist, if you could. What's the #1 action you would recommend attendees take today to care for ourselves and care for our planet?
I will jump in first here. And I just want, the 2 questions I get asked most right now is it too late and what should I do? And everything that you hear from everybody, climate change isn't real, it's not caused by humans, China's not going to solve it, so we can't do anything, it costs too much money to solve it. You hear all these things, they're all designed, and the most current one is it's too late. They're all designed to disempower you and keep you from taking any action on climate change. We have to understand that climate change is a social issue right now, much more than it is a technical issue. And we understand it, we know what to do. And what we need to do is when somebody asks you what, I would tell them that, that there's 3 things that they have to love everybody around them and make people secure and comfort in other ways so that they have a foundation, learn, but keep it to the big picture, not the details, and empower people, help people take action on climate change. And if you do that, especially in your workplace, in your community, you can leverage yourself a lot. We can all do a lot on climate change.
Thank you, Bob. Lightning round for anyone else. One action today. Yes.
So today I would say download and read the APA report, and also spread the word. However you do that, if you tweet or whatever you do, spread the word, make sure that people are aware of this. It's a fabulous resource. And I think that, and it is our theme today. So just read it. Thank you.
If I could give my one thing, I would say get connected. Get connected both in terms of talking to other people about the problem and also in organizing and connecting with those other people to come together to take action, because we can all do more collectively than we can do individually. And also it's more fun.
I really like what Dr. Van Susteren said in relation to the question about community level interventions. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that we have to change paradigms for how we attack some of these problems. And I was fortunate early in my career to get that message, and so I was more willing to develop new paradigms. So for that person, that doctoral student, I would really encourage you to really think about what's the next steps. The good news, at least on this front, is that there is a whole population health movement that is starting to emerge in the mental health field. And I think that you're going to find a lot of other folks that can join with you. But I would just say we got to be bold and we have to be courageous in challenging the status quo and the way we've always attacked some of these problems.
Thank you, Arthur. Lisa, we have about 30 seconds left if you'd like to add anything.
Okay. Maybe think of I love everything everybody said, maybe to reorient your idea about what climate anxiety is, think of it as your secret power and begin today to recognize that that is the force in you for change. If you harness it, you can take those emotions and redirect them into constructive action.
Nicole, thank you so much for hosting this for all of us. I know it's an extreme hassle to have 100 people sending you questions and trying to keep us under control. So thanks for all you did today, Nicole.
It's the most exciting part. It's been such an energizing conversation, and it is time to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you to all the speakers. Thanks to everybody for joining and helping spread the word on climate change and mental health. The recording will be available on ecoAmerica's YouTube channel afterwards. And like Dean Goldman said, you can also join us at the American Climate Leadership Summit. It's on March 28th to the 31st, and you can register with a free GW code that's in the chat. So thanks again for listening, and please join us in caring for ourselves to care for this planet. We'll see you soon.